Welcome again to the Barnes & Noble at Boston University. Thank you for joining us tonight and supporting our author events. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as BU Bookstore for a full lineup of events. Tonight we're pleased to welcome Caryl Rivers and Rosalind Barnett, authors of The Truth About Girls and Boys, Challenging Toxic Stereotypes About Our Children. The authors of Same Difference, How Gender Myths Are Hurting Our Relationships, Our Children, and Our Jobs, Rivers and Barnett tackle the dangerously incorrect theory that boys and girls are so fundamentally different, a theory which leads to unfair stereotyping and unhealthy attitudes. In breaking down these pseudoscientific ideas, Rivers and Barnett offer a way to transform how future generations perceive gender. Caryl Rivers is professor of journalism at Boston University. A nationally known author and journalist, she was awarded the Helen Thomas Lifetime Achievement Award for Distinguished Work in Journalism from the Society of Professional Journalists. Rosalind Barnett is senior scientist at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University and the recipient of a Radcliffe College Graduate Society's Distinguished Achievement Medal and the Ann Rowe Award from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education for her contribution to women's professional growth in the field of education. Both Barnett and Rivers received honorable mention in the 2011 Casey Medals for Meritorious Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caryl Rivers and Rosalind Barnett.
Well, thank you guys for coming. And, we're not going to do anything very academic, but we thought we'd talk for a couple of minutes about some of the things that we're working on, and then maybe do a conversation. Just let everybody talk. That should be really fun. So, Roz, I'll get you to start with our first talking point.
Okay, there's been a lot of talk and press about boys and girls' brains being very different. There's a book called Pink Brain, Blue Brain, which captures that sense. And it's gotten to be sort of conventional wisdom now. And the literature, which actually has been reviewed very competently in three new books that came out in the last 2 years, wonderful books actually, is very dramatic because it shows that there is absolutely no truth to this, that the boys and girls' brains, there might be some slight differences, but the big story is how similar they are. That the notion that there is a pink world, that girls see things differently, hear things differently, experience them differently because they have different brains, is completely erroneous, and leads people, when they think that way, to very different conclusions about and ideas about what girls and boys are interested in and good for. So I think we have to tackle that. Lisa Elliott, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, in her book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, she concludes that there's surprising little evidence of sex differences in children's brains. She starts out with the observation that if you look at children's behavior, young children, there are vast differences. Boys and girls really do behave differently, they play differently, and so forth. So she was thought she would find, when she looked into the research, correspondingly large differences in their brains, but did not find that. So her conclusion is that what's happening is that parents and socializers take boys and girls very young and start giving them very different experiences, and their brains operate in conjunction with their experiences, shaped by their experiences, so that innately they're very similar, but over time with these strong socialization pressures, they look different, but they're not innately that way.
And there's one fascinating experiment, because everybody says, oh, well, it has to be inborn. You see boys go for cars and trucks and girls go for Barbies. And there's a wonderful experiment where some researchers said, well, is it really innate, or maybe could it be something else? Maybe it could be the way toys are marketed. So they said, well, why don't we figure out what kids consider feminine and what kids consider masculine. And so they decided to take a couple of toys and trick them up differently. So, for example, this was the gun they took, if you can see this. They took this gun and they put sparkles and rhinestones and all sorts of stuff on it and made it pinky and purple. And then they took the teapot, the traditionally female toy, and they made it spiky and camo and everything. And then they went to the 5-year-olds and they said, okay, 5-year-olds, which toy is for girls and which toys are for boys? And what do you think the kids said? They said, this toy is for boys and this toy is for girls. So it was, I think, a wonderful example of the notion that it's not so much that the children somehow innately have this wish to go for these kind of toys, but they get messages very, very early on about what's appropriate for girls and what's appropriate for boys. And since kids really want to please older people, their parents and their teachers, they pick up those cues very, very early.
So you see that the marketers know this. So things are marketed to boys and girls based on these sort of cues that have nothing to do with gender, but have to do with what our people's ideas are about what girls and boys would like. So another point that we talk about is that boys are the nonverbal sex. We hear that a lot. Girls are verbal, boys are not verbal. Everyone's heard that. Is that right? You heard that before? And that because boys are not verbal, they can't manage hard English texts. They need informational texts, dumbed down, comic book, action type stuff, whereas girls, is thought, can handle a more, quote, verbally drenched curriculum. And this has now gotten to be so much in the conventional wisdom that is stated as fact, which, of course, if you think about it, leads down to a very bad situation for our boy students.
And it's really sad because I remember back, and I expect many of you do, in the days when who were the valedictorians, who were the editors of the newspapers, who were heads of the debating team? Well, they were the boys. And it was not thought, nobody ever said that boys, couldn't read or couldn't be verbal. This is something that's really sort of grown up lately. And when you actually look at the real abilities of boys and girls, there was one study that had something like, 7 million students. And when you see the bell curve, it's almost exactly the same, that there's virtually no difference in the verbal abilities of boys and girls. But what we're seeing is now that boys early on are being told, well, books really aren't for you. And so we see that if boys spend a lot of time playing video games and don't read, their scores go down. And if you don't give boys challenging material and really interesting stuff to read, then their performances are going to fall off. But there's just simply no truth to the fact that boys are naturally not verbal. And it's really very worrisome.
Another thing about that, the data like that Caryl might refer to, is that there's a terrific range on verbal ability for each sex. So you have within girls, some girls that are very verbal and some girls who are not very verbal, and all the way along. And the same for boys. So there's some boys that are more verbal than some girls, and some boys that are less verbal. So the notion that you would have a sort of pink box that says girls are all verbal and boys are not is such a distortion of the fact that if you know a kid is verbal, you don't know whether it's a girl or a boy. If you know a kid is a girl or a boy, you have no way of knowing whether they have high verbal or not high verbal abilities. So we do a disservice to kids by doing this sort of pigeonholing and setting up curricula and expectations and stimuli at home around those expectations. Oh, sure. Oh, can you do that? Okay, thank you. You might also want to come, people might want to come forward a little bit, too. Okay. Okay, let us know if that's better. Does that sound better? Okay. Yeah, okay.
Well, one of the things that we notice is the media narrative and the scientific narrative are going the absolute opposite direction. So I don't know if any of you saw these stories, but the story that women use 20,000 words a day and men use 7, if you've seen any of those headlines, they were all, their stories were from everywhere from Mumbai to the New York Times to the San Francisco Chronicle. These stories were presented as fact. And again, it was another notch in this story that says, men aren't verbal, they can't handle communication, they're not, they don't talk much, they're not emotional. And there was a bestseller called The Female Brain, which got, you can't imagine the play this book got. It was on Oprah, it was on CNN, it was just everywhere. And the interesting thing was, in my reading, not one reporter mentioned the fact that the British journal Nature said the book had its science wrong, it was really awful, the stats were wrong, the studies were wrong, just savaged it. But, it didn't say so. In the Q&A in the New York Times Magazine, nobody said, guess what, folks, this is a lousy book. Well, she popularized this notion, except, again, what was not reported until much later was that, in fact, a professor at the University of Austin did a study and found that, in fact, men and women use exactly the same number of words per day, and it's 16,000. That is not true that men are strong and silent and women are blabbermouths. It's so quickly become the conventional wisdom, and I do blame the media on this because the media reports this stuff so uncritically. That's maybe it's because they haven't got enough reporters who know anything about science, or maybe because just a good, sexy story will sell and get it up there.
Another reason I think why that took off so is that it fit in with the kind of common stereotype that women are chatty and they like to schmooze with their friends, and men are the strong, silent types. So when something resonates with what you believe anyway, you're less critical about it, and that's another way in which these things keep perpetuating.
And there's another narrative which has been very popular lately, and that is that boys and men gravitate toward systems, math, leadership, understanding of systems, and females gravitate towards feelings, understanding people, communications, and being helpful and good partners. And this you'll see it in Parents Magazine. It was in a BBC documentary. What's happened that this has now become the conventional wisdom that men are the math thinkers and women are the communicators and the relationers. And the way this came about was a fascinating. There was a study by a British psychologist who looked at a bunch of newborns, day-old infants, and he had their parents pick them up and figure out which they were looking at. Well, he said the girls looked at people and the boys looked at the mobiles. And from that one study, he said that the male brain is made for understanding symptoms, math, leadership, aggression, systematizing, and he had 4 things that the female brain was good at: gossiping, reading your partner, mothering, and
making friends.
Making friends. And this was, the degree to which this kind of thing is accepted is just, it's amazing. And yet there was a scientist at Harvard named Elizabeth Spelke, and she looked and said, first of all, the study's no good because newborns can't hold their head up independently. So what the babies looked at was when their parents propped them up, they stared at whatever angle their parents were holding them at, and the researchers didn't account for that. So it was a terrible study, and it was an outlier study. There are tons and tons and tons of studies showing that male and female infants respond pretty much the same to both people and objects, and yet those studies were never mentioned in most stories I read. The terrible studies were never mentioned, but this narrative was mentioned, and because of the internet, it's all over. It's just picked up again and again and again.
It was taken as sort of proof or example of why women are not suited for engineering or high-level positions that require logical thinking, where men are. So not only did it distort the data about one-day-olds, but it was extrapolated out to have all kinds of lifelong and career implications for adults, which is really bizarre. But it caught on, and it's, as Caryl said, it's everywhere. And it kind of fits in with some other stuff that is out there as well. It's another narrative that girls' and boys' brains are so different, and that girls' brains are such that they're not suited to do math or science innately, and that boys have these particular structures that make them much more likely to do well in math. Now, if you believe that kids are hardwired in this kind of way, then it's clear, if you really believe that giving them different inputs or different opportunities is a waste of time. Why would you try to get a little girl interested in something where her brain isn't set up for her to succeed at that? So it's another thing where if you look at the brain studies, there may be some slight differences in brain structures between boys and girls, but they're tiny, and they in no way could possibly account for the belief that boys are wired for math. In fact, it's hard to imagine what that even means. But it's been taken in. And in one of the anecdotes in the book, we interviewed a teacher of a preschool, and she was telling me on the phone that day one of school, a mother came in with a little girl, and she said to the teacher, I want to tell you that my daughter's not really good at math. And I said to this woman, what could she possibly mean that a 5-year-old is not good at math? But somehow, I have no idea what that could possibly mean, but somehow she had it in her head that this little girl was already not going to be good at math. And if she believed that, it's clear she already had an impact. She was telling the teacher, go light with her, don't push her in math, that's not her thing. And this is just 2 years ago.
And in fact, back in 1980, there was a suggestion made that boys had a math gene that girls didn't possess. And it was pretty much debunked when people went back. Actually, what was happening is they looked at a bunch of talented kids, and they found out that the boys' scores, SAT scores, tended to be higher. But then when people went around and looked, they found out that, the parents of these kids, if their boys were talented, they'd run out and buy them Legos and games and be excited about the math, and the girls were absolutely ignored. The parents thought their girls were good in math. They didn't bother. So the girls were really neglected. So the boys got to push upward, and the girls sort of got to push downward. And there was a study 10 years later. They did a study, and when the parents who remembered those stories, even after 10 years, their estimates of their children's math abilities, their daughters' math abilities, went way down. So the media narratives are really affecting how people look at their kids.
We can see other ways in which these stereotypes influence parents, even when kids are really young. There was a very interesting study done just a few years ago with mothers of toddlers, really little kids, and they were trying to look at risk-taking behavior. So they had a room outfitted, a carpeted room, and there was a ramp, and you could adjust the angle of the ramp, more steep or less steep. So first they asked the mothers to adjust the ramp to the angle they thought their daughters and sons would be happy going down. And then after they did that, that was noted all the data, they turned the kids loose, these little kids. And it turns out that the differences between how much risk the kids would take was very small. In fact, girls were a little more daring than boys. So there was a gigantic difference. The mothers thought the girls would choose the less steep slope. They thought their girls would be hesitant to go down something that was steeper. But the boys had thought, oh, no problem here. So there was vast differences in the mothers' perceptions. And these, of course, were stereotyped. I mean, they never were in a situation where they had the opportunity to watch their kids go down a real steep ramp. So this wasn't that they learned what their kids would prefer, but they went in with that expectation, and they were completely wrong. So you can just imagine, if you extend that out, that mothers would then potentially provide their kids with very different opportunities to test out their strengths, to learn how to take risks, to learn how to respond to challenge. And girls if they think girls need to be protected and to be coddled, then they're going to have girls who avoid risk because they haven't been exposed to risk.
And when you push it further on out, you start saying, well, when you look at the workplaces and the careers you should prepare women for, women should not take any job that requires risk. And Steven Pinker of Harvard, who is a big deal, and he lectures all the time and writes, articles and gives speeches, and he claims that men like risk, women are risk averse, that women basically want low-level jobs in comfortable air-conditioned offices. I swear to God, that's what he said. And, so starting from, if you start with an infant and you say they can't have risk, and then you keep telling them they shouldn't take any risks, and then when you want to hire somebody, you're not going to hire a woman for a risky job because quite clearly she's not hardwired for risk. You see how all this becomes really a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There's another story I think that warrants a lot of attention. We are told that caring is a girl's behavior. Girls are nurturing, they're empathic, they like to be helpful and cooperative, but boys not so much. But if you look at it, for little kids, really little, boys are just as nurturing and caring as girls. They want to be helpful. They're there. You can shaking your heads. You probably can tell us some stories which we'd like to hear. So boys and girls start out being like this. But then the opportunities for boys to be caring start to fall away, partly out of the belief they can't do it. So if a mother has a child and they need a babysitter, they're much more likely to ask the daughter to babysit the baby than the son. And they're much more likely to assume the girl's going to do well at that and be a good caretaker in general. So over time, the experiences girls and boys get in the caretaking realm are very, very different. So boys start to become less experienced in practice in caring. And then girls become over-practiced, overlearn. And so we make a gigantic difference where there wasn't one to start with.
And William Pollack, who's a terrific psychologist at Harvard, wrote a book called Real Boys. And he points out that there's some studies that show that baby boys are more emotionally expressive than baby girls. But what he sees in his practice is that, boys start to adopt what he calls the mask of masculinity, that they start to sort of self-censor and to become more like the male stereotype. You're wimpy if you care. If you're not aggressive and you don't push people, you're not a guy. And so that these boys who really are very empathetic by nature are learning to adopt a pose that's really not what they're like. And if you push that down the road, you'll see men who do have trouble with emotions and who are uncomfortable with it because they've lost what they had when they were babies, and they have to be retrained for something they innately knew.
There's another thing that's out here in the media a lot now. It's about the fact that girls and boys have different learning styles. And this is usually picked up around the issue of single versus coeducation, although not exclusively in that domain. And one of the key things that is supposed to distinguish boys and girls is that boys do really well when they can be active learners. So then in the classroom, you expect them they're encouraged to run around, to stand up, to not sit quietly, because their physical activity is thought to promote their learning. It was very interesting because it's repeated over and over. Now that you're aware of it, you'll probably see it when you read some of the articles that are around now about single-sex education. Well, we ended up interviewing one of the main researchers who's done this work, and I caught him at the airport. Happily, he wasn't yet on his plane, and I asked him if he saw any gender differences in his data. He said he's looked and looked and looked, and he hasn't found any. So in other words, if activity is associated with better learning, it's associated with better learning for boys and girls alike. So the fact that it's only talked about with respect to boys is selling girls short. So the people who are talking about what's the ideal classroom for a boy, having this active environment, but not so much for girls, then girls aren't going to be in a place where they're encouraged to run around and get worked up and get their juices running. So they end up getting shortchanged in an environment that looks only at differences and resonates with the stereotype that boys are active.
And the state of South Carolina, which is they're having a goal to have almost all of their classrooms, public school classrooms, be single sex. And you look at what they're doing, they are setting up girls' classes where the girls, they have quiet classical music playing, and the girls sit very close to the teachers. The teachers never speak loudly to them. So it's a very unchallenging kind of languid classroom. And when they do chemistry, they analyze cosmetics. So, and this is supposed to be the girl classroom. Well, it's a terrible classroom, and there's just a new study we looked at which shows that when you're splitting boys and girls into for science and math, teachers tend to teach the boys and girls differently. The boys get real back and forth. Then back and forth, they really ask. They say, they challenge. The teacher challenges the boys. But even the same teacher, when they go into the girls' classroom, they don't challenge. They don't encourage the girls to get this back and forth. And that's really the essence of science: is you challenge, you push things. So even though they think they're doing the best for the girls and boys, they're getting a class where the girls are not getting what the boys are getting.
It was interesting in that study, if you looked at the test scores at the end of the semester, the boys and girls had the same test scores roughly. So they learned the same amount of material, but because these people videotaped to see what the interaction was actually in the classroom, they discovered that the process of learning was very different. So boys were getting this argumentation training, which they could then learn and take it to other environments. Girls were not getting that. So it was only by being more sophisticated and asking a more subtle question about what is really going on in these single-sex classrooms. And then they found out that it was a very different learning experience. And I think that's the way of the future. People are developing much more sophisticated tools for doing these assessments and asking much better questions about how do kids learn and are there gender differences in how they learn.
And in a lot of the boy classrooms, the reading material is very dumbed down. For example, in one school system, they wouldn't give boys certain books to read. To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, they wouldn't give boys to read because they said, well, that's too emotional. Boys wouldn't understand it. Let's give them some comic book combat kind of book. So what you're seeing is if you keep doing that, boys' vocabulary is going to be a lot less rich. Their understanding of emotions and their expressing of emotions are going to be very paucite. They're going to get really dumbed down. And so you say, are we really basically saying that boys shouldn't be writers or, presidential speech writers or, all these wonderful areas where verbal skills and being able to express yourself are a real part of what you have to do. So that what we see is it's not just that we're penalizing girls, we're also penalizing boys by this sort of pink and blue box system.
And one more thing that I want to talk about, we were really surprised. It was a study that came out of Brigham and Young not that many years ago. And they did a study with 18-month-olds and 24-month-olds, 2 years olds, to see if they could distinguish or get an idea of how early kids got notions of gender stereotyping. They had a very clever design. They put the little babies in a little seat, and in front of them were two video screens, and they showed pictures simultaneously. There was two kinds. It was male or female, and female was either doing a stereotypical female or male thing, and vice versa. So you had a woman who was shaving and a man doing nail polish, or a woman putting on, making a tie, or whatever. They did vary. So the men doing stereotypical male things or female things, and vice versa. And the idea was, if the child hadn't seen this before, it was a novel stimulus, they would look longer at something they hadn't seen before. If it was something they were familiar with, they would look less long. Well, it turned out that by 24 months of age, for boys and girls, they showed evidence that they had already ideas, rudimentary ideas, of what behaviors go with what gender. So these babies who are not verbal are really absorbing in their day and experience that the world is divided into male and female, and that certain behaviors go with those two sexes. So I think it's an eye-opener for parents, that the kids are really tuned in. They absorb and they're learning. And those learnings, early learnings, by the way, in this area, and maybe in other areas as well, have very deep roots. Once you have in your head the notion that this is a girl thing and that's a boy thing, it's very hard to undo that. You can learn later, and of course people do learn, but the early learning has a very powerful effect.
And it's interesting because Howard Gardner of Harvard, who talks about different intelligences, that people have a number of kinds of intelligences, and he sort of said kids do start out with this great unfettered view of the world, that they can explore anything, they can do anything, but fairly quickly they begin to want to please parents. And this pleasing of parents really puts them into these straight. If the parents want to send them in this direction, if the parents get horrified if a boy, puts on nail polish, or if a girl, goes out and climbs a fence and gets dirty, these kids get that message and they change their behavior, they limit their behavior. And since we're seeing this whole pink and blue narrative, what we're seeing is that more and more we're putting up a world where we limit people. And since, the interesting thing is that boys and girls they have differences, but there are more differences among boys and among girls than there are between the sexes. So you have to look at kids as individuals because they're so different from one another, never mind the gender, that if you don't, have a way of looking at kids individually, if you just put them into boxes, you really do start them down stereotype roads very early.
I think across these last few points is the message that these things start very early, and it's really incumbent, I think, on parents and teachers, especially at the younger grades, to be very cognizant of what they're doing, to not do the thing, girls on one side of the room and boys on the other, to have kids be treated as kids, all kids who want to have hot lunches come on the front of the room, and forget the gender piece, and just be much more aware, actually trying to stretch out the notions of what's girl-like and what's boy-like. So if a little boy is being quiet, it's not like saying, oh, what's wrong with Johnny, but some are quiet and some are not quiet, and it's fine, because boys come in different packages, and the same with girls. And help parents also to see, that not to be worried if their little girl is too, outgoing or something. That is fine. All of this is fine, because the definition of female can encompass all that stuff. It doesn't mean that she's less female because she's not conforming to the stereotype.
Well, there was, I guess it was back in April, J. Crew had a catalog, and it showed one of the executives playing with her little son, and the kid had bright pink toenails, and they were both laughing. They were clearly having a wonderful time. Well, you would have thought. Jon Stewart called it Toe-mageddon. And he showed clips from Fox and CNN and CBS with all these commentators saying, oh my God, what are we doing? What have we come to? And it's interesting because you see that, we let, when kids go get their faces painted, and if they get their faces painted as cats, we don't think they're going to turn into cats. And if little boys love to put on paint. And there was an interesting, I think it was a Fisher-Price daycare center, they had a bottle of toenail polish. Well, the girls and the boys all rushed to the toenail polish, and they slathered it all, purple and pink and green, all over their their toes and their fingernails. But when the fathers came, the boys wouldn't go near it. So they had that message. It was okay when it was just among the teachers and their peers to do this, but somehow when their fathers were there, that was not something they could do.
So there's all kinds of data, and we have a lot more, but I think it'd be fun to hear some of your stories and your responses and have a little bit of discussion about how these notions affect you, how you've been affected by them, how they play out in your lives. So I think maybe we should do that.
Yeah, good idea. Let's.
Yes.
I'm still trying to figure this out, but Bill Bennett has come out with a book. I just read the review. Tom Ashbrook is about to do an NPR show. What about men? Because statistically, men are the minority in almost all undergraduate college experiences, an increasing minority in professional and PhD programs, many more men in prison, many more men who are single fathers, and Bill Bennett is making the argument that in some ways we're trying to give so much support to women, and I haven't read his book, and he is a social conservative, former education secretary, that the men, the young men, are getting sort of put down, pushed aside from our traditional educational systems.
Yeah, you know what? This is, you'll pardon the expression, bourgeois. But no, what am I trying to say? Bilge water. Bullshit was what I was trying to say. I mean, and there's a book, the Lancet cover story in that book, The End of Men. Well, when you really start looking at what's happening, yes, first of all, there are more men going to college and more women going to college than ever before. There are more women in classrooms, but when you start looking at who they are, the Ivy League is still more male than female.
Actually, that's not true. It's only in one Ivy League school.
If it's
There's only 10 undergraduate schools, I was really fascinated by this, that have a majority male. And some of them you wouldn't be surprised, MIT, etc. But there are, it's striking, the makeup.
But you're not seeing it you're not seeing it at the Ivies where, you know, there's a great preponderance of women. If it's pretty equal. But when you go down into other classrooms, there are more women than men. But when you start looking, one of the reasons for this is that minority women are moving into college classrooms in great numbers. And that's one of the things that's skewing what's happening. So, and you're also having older women coming back. And you're seeing men are not going into some of their traditional areas, which are liberal arts colleges, so they're going into business schools. But the interesting thing is, the argument of the end of men is that women are taking up all these college classrooms, which means in the next generation, they're going to occupy all the good jobs. Well, yeah. but the truth is that the Sloan Foundation went and looked at this, and they said, yeah, you go and the women have they're the valedictorians, they have more women, etc. But guess what? 10 years down the road, as we go down the road, women lose and men gain, so that 5 years out of school, women are like 5% behind men. By 10 years, they're 10% behind men. So that if you only look at who's in a classroom right now, you might say, oh, it's the end of men. But the projections ahead show that that doesn't hold up, that women do not sustain that kind of level of achievement, and men do. And you can see why. Women still have the great majority of caring for children. There's no maternity leave. There's no there's no paid family leave, health leave. So that what you find is that maybe if we put all those kind of things into place, and then if women kept soaring ahead, then I'd agree with the argument. But right now it's just, I mean, you look around, where are all the women CEOs? Where are the women generals? Where are the women, heads of everything?
Do you think that might change, though, once this generation of college-educated women are going to come through the pipeline?
Not to the degree that they're suggesting, because, for example, the in the End of Men piece that Hannah Rosen wrote for The Atlantic. I love this piece. She went to interview some 19-year-olds, and she interviewed one woman who said, I'm going to be a surgeon, and I'm going to be the breadwinner in my family, and my husband's going to take care of the kids. And Hannah Rosen used this as an argument that, as data, as indeed that was what was going to happen. And I'm saying, good luck, kid. You know, that's not data. That's a 19-year-old projecting something that probably isn't going to happen 10 years from now. And you see these arguments filled with all that kind of crappy data. And, you know, what we see is this set up as a zero-sum game. You give to women, men lose. You give to men, women lose. And that's a bad argument. You know, the argument should be we've got to help both sexes.
I want to just make a couple of points about that. If you take a snapshot of what's happening in college classrooms now, you see that girls may be a majority in boys across the board. But if you take a time view over time, well, the real story is that there are more boys going to college now than ever before, increasingly so, and more girls going to college than before. Now, the rate of increase for girls is faster, so that girls are catching up, but that they came from a lower place anyway. So as one researcher stated, that this is not a story about boys losing, it's about girls gaining. So boys are doing about what they did, girls are gaining faster. So that's one piece. The other thing is that there's some very interesting new studies that show that when you have a narrative like the one you're talking about, it sort of focuses on how well women are doing, they're going to just take off. Well, what happens? The men hear that, and a couple of things happen. A, they get anxious, and they get to be more identified with their gender, and they start to have very negative feelings about women, because women are going to threaten their status. Now, when women hear that story, they feel different. Oh, yeah, well, you know, we're doing well.
Yeah,
we're
great.
doing well. Now, if you take the story just at one point in time, like today, and look at the data that way. So educated women now still earn 76 cents of the dollar. There's been no change in the wage gap. And there are a number of the statistics right now that show very big gender differences favoring men. Men do much better right now than women. Now, when men hear that story, they feel pretty good. They're doing well right now. And women don't feel so great about that. So if you end up with the End of Men story, that men are going to be, you know, edged out, you end up making it harder for women. Men get more defensive, and women have to fight even harder. So I think those stories, they're just as simplistic, they're catchy, they're sexy, they get headlines, but they have, there are consequences to seeing the world that way.
And they don't break the statistics down by race. So when you do that, it's an enormous difference. For example, you talk about boys dropping out of school. Well, in Newton, boys aren't dropping out of school, but they sure are in Dorchester. And when you see lots of men in prison, again, Shaker Heights kids aren't going to prison, but Black and Hispanic males really are going to prison. But I think that the media does not like to present these facts because, let's face it, who buys publications? White folks. And when Newsweek did a story called The Boy Crisis, it put 4 white suburban boys on the cover, even though obviously the boy crisis is worst among, you know, Black inner city kids and rural kids. But that's not a sexy story for the media. So you see very little coverage of poverty and these issues. You see much more the end of men, you know, my poor kid is going to get out of Yale and some woman is going to take his job, you know.
Yeah.
I'd be curious, and it's a question for both of you and also Tom Fiedler, who's here. It's
Representing
striking.
the men.
Yeah, right.
It's striking in the, I don't know if it's true for the College of Communication, but in the journalism department, how few boys, young men there are relative to number of women. And I'm curious why. I'm curious from a social science standpoint, and Tom is the dean of the College of Communication. What thoughts you might have about that?
I ought to be informed by the facts before I try to answer with.
Well, I mean, I think it is true that this is it's been happening for a long time, and I think several things are happening. One, first of all, I think the issues in journalism are are very much a part of it. The job issues are part of it. And also the idea that boys aren't being urged into fields where communication and verbal ability are stressed. That may
But
be
it didn't
part
used
of
to
it.
be that way.
No, it didn't.
I mean, newspapers were dominated by.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's, well, I think possibly those two things that have changed, the market issue and, I'm kind of, in a way, kind of baffled by some of it because I would think that journalism is a great job if you're a guy. Mm-hmm. That you get to go out and meet interesting people. It's adventurous. It's exciting, but certainly, I guess we're not maybe doing a good enough job of selling our field. But all along the way in communication, women are coming much more into it, and men are not. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I think this is not based on fact, but I saw this happening in newsrooms from my career. My first, 1971 was when I went into the newsroom, and I think that probably in 1971 newsrooms were probably majority male. And then over the years, it was a gradual shift, but persistent and steady. And I do know that toward the end of my career in newsrooms, the newsroom leadership positions were well shared. When I was editor of the Miami Herald, my managing editor was a woman. The investigations editor was a woman. The business department chair was a woman. And I don't think, so my sense has been that over time, journalism, I think this is true of public relations and advertising, the related fields, have been fields where the barriers to success have diminished. I wouldn't say they've gone completely, but they've diminished to where women feel that they can be as successful as men, and that's starting to prove true. And maybe that has created the perception where more women who have those talents will go into it. But I do also think there's a self-fulfilling prophecy about that. I'm not quite sure why fewer men
That's
aren't
the
going
question.
into that
Not
field.
what-
One thing that happened is we do know that when any profession gets more women in it, its prestige sinks. So that that may be another reason that if journalism is now seen as more of a woman's profession, men are going to say, well, that's not for me.
I wonder, and I, again, have no facts, if it also is partly driven by revenue potential or income. I don't know in the earlier days of journalism if that paid as well as being on Wall Street or being in a bank or.
But
But certainly, and I get disappointed in these generations I see coming into higher education now, or graduating or in graduate school. A lot of their thought is, what am I going to make? Or I want to make a lot of money. I hear lots of young men in particular say, I want to make a lot of money. I don't know if they want to be breadwinners or they learned that somewhere. And of course, I must be referring to white middle-class men, because I don't think Hispanic gentlemen and African Americans are necessarily thinking that when they came from a culture that doesn't teach that. But I do wonder, I'm sure at a very high level, at the editor level, that or a publisher level, that it is a very well paid industry, but at sort of the basic everyday level or the entry level, I think, that businesses and advertising agencies and even PR firms probably pay better. And I wonder if that's a driving factor.
I think it probably is, and particularly now when, there's so much of the, the idea, oh yeah, you can go out and work for Patch and make, $2 a story. And we're also coming off a time when, kids could go into Wall Street and make, within 2 years could make $100,000. Now that's gone. But I think that the reality maybe hasn't sunk in so much that those amazing salaries that very young people could make, that day is over, I think.
I think a lot has to do with the culture of either journalism or any of the careers of what young people are feeling. And by way of example, I have 4 daughters, 2 graduated from college and 2 in college, and the one that just graduated from the University of Miami last May, she and her boyfriend both went to Morgan Stanley this summer to interview separately, 2 different departments in New York City because they both want to live there. And she's a very good math student, both Miami, both economics majors, and his interview process, they each had a couple interviews, whatever, his was such a different experience. He would come home, it was a whole old boys network, they were telling him what suits to wear, they were whatever. When she went in for a second interview, there was 4 men at the table, and she's an attractive young woman, and she's wearing, I told her, wear a black suit, your hair in a ponytail, I was doing the whole thing, and glasses, whatever, and she went in there, and they actually made the comment that, are you sure you want to do finance in like the fashion industry? And she wore low heels, and she played into it, the whole thing too. Like, I said, didn't you just say anything? Not like repulsive, but not like, no, I'm very interested in whatever. She sort of laughed it off. And I'm like, oh my God, you laughed it off? But, so you know what I mean? So she played into that too, because then she appears not aggressive enough, and she appears whatever, but she really is aggressive, whatever. So then the end of that story is, he progressed, she didn't, and separate. These people didn't know each of them were doing it, and he had to take math exams. And so he took it at 2 a.m, not studying, without a calculator. And so he goes into the 3rd interview, and halfway through, somebody knocks on the door, and they stop the interview, and it's sort of like, here's the door, because you didn't do well in the math. Now, she would have killed the math exam, And so it's just a good conversation piece for us as a family, but there's all that to deal with, too, in terms of the environment, the welcomingness of the environment, I would say.
I think another piece of it is that we talk about how easy it is for women. Men are having a hard time, but women aren't. Women, there are endless stories about how women are exposed to this sort of more subtle form of sexism. Yeah, she can be invited, let's have her in, but she's there for 4 men and putting in an environment which puts her into a defensive position.
Right, and then you're at ease, ill at ease trying to
Right.
interview. You're like, okay, you start questioning yourself, what did I wear? Whatever.
And there's some real evidence, which is very interesting, that when companies really get in trouble and they're on the ropes, that's when they put a woman in as a CEO. That they figure that everything's going to hell anyhow, might as well let the woman run it and go off the cliff.
At the Simmons Leadership Conference, Xerox, I can't remember her name, great lady, said exactly that. They put her in, it was the worst of the worst. She'd been there 23 years, and they had not given her the job when it first came open, and then that person didn't work out so well, they gave it to her, and she turned it all around, but it was the worst of the worst.
But what's interesting about that, it's been called the glass ceiling thing, because people had noticed that when there were women who were at the top, the stocks tended to go down in these companies, and the inference was, oh, well, see, women can't do it, they can't cut it. And then when people went back and looked at it hard, the stock was going down before they had the woman come aboard. So they had her in when the thing was already tanking. So the causation went the other way. Women didn't cause the stock to crash. The stock crashing caused them to hire the woman in the first place. It was pretty interesting. They've also found that to be true in politics. So when a woman is put up for a seat in the political world, it tends to be a seat where it's unlikely for a woman to win. When the seat is going to be challenged, women are more likely to be put into that slot. If it looks like the seat's going to be won, then they're less likely to have a woman candidate for that seat.
And one study interviewed a lot of women in high tech, which is an area that's really people want to go into now. And what they said, almost to a woman, was that men could fail, but women didn't get any second chances. That if you were a woman and you failed at something, that was it, you were gone. But if you were a man and you sort of rushed off to save a situation and you tried your hardest and it didn't work, the guys would say, yeah, it was a great job. Good try, Charlie. You didn't do it this time, but next time you'll get it. So the women really felt that affected their ability to take risks, because risk-taking is also the way you get ahead. And they said, we can't be quite as free as the guys can be, because when we take risks, we know we're putting our job on the line, and they're not. So those are all sort of subtle things that that I'm sure Bill Bennett isn't going to talk about.
Right. I'd be curious, you explained innately they're different, but by the time they get to high school, they've had so many years of being shaped. English high school in Boston is a turnaround school, and this is its second year doing single-sex classes. They started with just 9th grade last year, and then they've made it to 3 of the core classes in 10th grade are also single-sex. So I wonder if you know anything about, I actually don't know that literature, but just, it's already they've already been shaped for 9 years, but maybe there is, because it's largely African-American males, and I think that was part of the purpose, is trying to get some, positive solidarity and let's make a change and kind of mentorship going on. If you knew anything about.
Well, I can't speak to that specific school, but in terms of the overall literature, it's something like this, that first of all, it's very hard to do good research in this area. Because there's too many variables: class size, teachers' experience, parental expectations, kids' expectations, what kind of grades they had coming into the class. A million things are going on, so it's really hard to sort out what's due to the gender similarity, per se. So having said that, the few studies that have been considered good enough to pay attention to do not show any advantage to single versus co-ed. It's about the same academically. And socially, people say, well, it's less disruptive for boys to be by themselves and girls make it. No evidence of that at all. And there is some evidence that the single-sex schools are associated with higher sex stereotyping among the kids. So when you don't have the opposite sex to sort of tamp down some of these stereotypes, they then flourish. And the outgroup, the other sex, seems more distant, more unlike you. So we don't see an advantage, and we might have some disadvantage. So I think that there's no evidence. In fact, there's a major study, just came out last month in Science, reviewing all this literature and concluding that there's no reason, no scientific basis for segregating the kids on the basis of sex, period.
Would you do away with Wellesley and Smith?
That's private and that's college. I think at the private level and in college, you can do anything you want. We're talking about how to allocate dollars for public education. And in a time when we have philosophically, I mean, at the private level, in public level grades, you can send your kid to a private Catholic school or a Protestant school or a Jewish, anything you want. And philosophically, if that's what you want, there's no data to say it's terrible or anything. If you want to do that, you should do it.
But you seem to be arguing that it's not the best idea,
There's
the
no
best
data,
way to learn.
That's right. There's no data like that, but you might believe. If you were brought up and you went to Windsor, but take a public school. Although I must say, I did look this up because someone asked me about it. The best I can tell, the exam schools, the public exam schools, have almost all become co-ed. There was a time not that long ago when there were single-sex co-eds. When I say exam schools, that was single-sex. I know that for a fact because I was in New York and here too. And they've gone to co-ed because there is no justification now for that. And that's not to say that if you want to send your daughter to Wellesley, sure, that's fine.
But I think most people go to Wellesley not because it's a girls' school, because it's a great school. The faculty is great. The alumni is fabulous. And I think back in the 50s, I think it was true that the single-sex schools took girls seriously, and by and large, a lot of the co-ed schools do not. But that's really changed a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You seem to indicate you had a story you wanted to tell earlier on. Was I misreading?
Oh, it's just anecdotal when you were talking about boys being more caring or being able to be as caring as girls. It was, and I have no children, so I should have no idea about this. But I taught a couple years in a row at a church that I went to, a Sunday school class that was 10 boys. They were all boys. And I think I started with them when they were 4, and then 5, and then 6, those 3 years. And the interesting thing to me was, because these were young boys, how caring they were, particularly if they had younger sisters, little sisters that they had to take care of. And I was particularly surprised one day, I don't know why I came up with this idea, we were going to make puppets. And I was going to have them glue the puppets together, and that didn't work. So I'm like, okay, we're going to sew. And I thought, these guys will think this is so sissy, having to do running stitches in it. And they thought that was the coolest thing, because they were 5 and there was no one there to tell them that wasn't cool to be sewing a puppet. So that's just.
But can you imagine 3 or 4 years later, same kids, and now you say they would never.
That's right.
And why not? Because they would have gotten the message that that's a girl thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My father will kill me if I do that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have the exaggerated version of this story because I see it as a psychological game and play. And of course, if you go to a country like Iran, everything is in a ridiculously exaggerated level. So this talk that in Iran women are more in colleges, in universities, taking over all the good jobs, went as far as they put quota for women entering college. And that was very, very clear that from that government, what they want is actually nobody going to college. But definitely they don't
Not
want
women.
women go to college. So first there was this huge advertisement that, oh, the girls are going to university so much that now the boys are being deprived, and to protect boys' democratic right, they put quotas so they would not accept all the girls who had passed the exam. And so that's something that when I see that level of, I don't know, I keep on calling it corruption, but it's a psychological game. And so I see it happening here too, that the game is that, oh, the girls are taking over and the boys are now deprived. And of course they cannot go as far as putting quota on girls going to school, but it has its effects.
Yes. I have a question. You are co-authors, and I wonder how you write together. Does somebody write one sentence and then they edit it? How did you work together? Yeah.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. We may. It's a very. Well, here's how it goes. I think we develop an idea. We develop an outline. We work it and work it and work it. We develop ideas for each chapter. We work those, and then my thing is to get the research and to digest it. You see what's really interesting and important, well done, and put it in the best reader-friendly English I can, which isn't so great. But and then Caryl gets it, and she does her magic.
Right, and then I give it back to Roz to edit, because she's a really good editor.
What is your magic, Caryl?
Oh,
What is the Caryl magic?
she won't tell you. I'll tell you. Caryl she brings to a huge amount of social information, media and social stuff and media, just everything. And she has a wonderful flowing style. It's her voice in our books. It's our 5th book together. And so she writes, it's her voice, and she sets the voice for the whole thing. And then we do massive amounts of back and forth editing and reading, and so at the end of it,
Yeah, we finish each other's sentences at the end of it.
Yeah, we do.
You live in the same city?
Well, we live in
No,
the
we
same city.
live
but
in
I
the same
spend a lot of
city.
time with you.
People see us in my office, sitting there hunched together, going over stuff.
Right. Yeah, we do together. We work together. Yeah. How about? Well, it was our 5th book together. You
Yeah.
tell us how many years. A lot of years. We do a lot of presenting together and other kind of writing together as well. It's very good for me because as a psychologist, I do a lot of professional writing and chapters and that sort of stuff. And I often think this material is interesting. It should reach a wider audience, and there's no way that someone with my background can do that. And Caryl is wonderful because she can do that, and she also, speaking for you.
Thank you.
She also has a sense of what's really good. Pulls things together in a way that I wouldn't even think about, because I'm thinking about it in statistics, and she's thinking about it in a different kind of context. And they say, oh yeah, that's exactly right.
And as a journalist, it's great because Roz really knows a lot of great wealth of the detail of the research and the stuff that's out there. So it makes it much easier for me to look at what's being reported and to say, boy, that's bilge, because if I had to go try to find that myself all the time, it would take me 10 times longer.
So we read different things. Carol's much more up on current, what's out in the trade books, and I'm reading journal articles. So it's really, it's a
7 books together, is it?
5.
Excuse me.
Well, it may end up being 7.
We're working on that, but
We're working on 6. But
That's a lot of work.
yeah, it's fun. I just love it. I just think it's great, and it's a really been a fabulous relationship for me. Well, I don't know what fight means. We have maybe disagree. Yeah, sometimes. And I think we both. I don't know. How would you answer that question?
yeah, and I think we both are very respectful of the other's position. So, if Roz feels strongly about something, I'll say, yeah, let's do that, and vice versa. So, so we don't really have what you'd call arguments, but we sort of work things out to make sure that everybody gets what they want.
I remember anecdote. I was working at Winthrop at Carol's one time, and we were working on a wide table with 2 computers. And Alan, Carol's late husband, ran down the stairs and said, "Why aren't you screaming at each other? Fred is always arguing with each other.
You're right.
Why aren't you
Yeah. What's wrong with you people?
It was very funny because there was none of that. Yeah. So.
And we've written in strange places, like when we were doing the final version of, I guess it was Same Difference, I was in the hospital with a bout of pancreatitis. So Roz would come. The only place she could sit was on the portable potty. And my roommate kept getting up and falling, clocking over. So we had to go run and help pick her up. So, I said, "Sorry about this, Roz. This is not what you call the way we thought we were going to finish this book."
Yeah, that was really funny because it was a very big book, and I had made 2 Xerox copies of it, 3-hole punch, because we were doing the final edits on all the references. It was very complicated, so it was spread out. So I would schlep these big books, and it was really a scene.
And they kept throwing us out of the conference room.
Right.
We had our own papers on the conference. The doctors would come in for their meeting. We'd say, "You can't have this room," and they'd say, "We're the doctors. You're the patients. You leave."
Yeah, it was a trip, I'll tell you. Yeah, so it was fun. It's a lot of fun. It was great.
Well, your reputation definitely is wonderful, because I emailed a professor I work with a lot at BU, Mary Shan, said, "I can't meet you tonight. I'm going to this. I saw this thing come out in BU today, and I thought, oh, this would be interesting. I'm going to go to this." And she wrote, "Well, you're in for a treat. These are brilliant women who've worked 30 years together," right? So she knew the whole. So I was like, "Oh,
Oh, that's nice. Those are nice words.
Right. Well, thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you guys. This was really fun.